They turned their backs on me at Dad's funeral, whispering about how I was the family disappointment. But what they didn't know was that while they saw failure, the FBI saw their most valuable secret weapon. The rain fell in steady sheets that Tuesday morning, turning the cemetery into a sea of black umbrellas and whispered judgments. I stood at the edge of the crowd, watching my siblings huddle together like they always had, their expensive suits and designer dresses a stark contrast to my simple black dress that had seen too many covert operations to count. The gray sky seemed to mirror the coldness I felt radiating from my own family, the people who should have been my sanctuary in this moment of grief. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know you're here with me. Just say listening in the comments or tell me where you're tuning in from. I love knowing how far this story reaches. My sister Rebecca caught sight of me and immediately turned to whisper something to my brother David, their eyes flicking toward me with that familiar mixture of embarrassment and disdain. Here I was, 34 years old, still the black sheep who couldn't get her life together, still the disappointment who showed up to family functions alone and left early with vague excuses about work. They had no idea that the phone in my purse had been buzzing all morning with messages marked Priority 1, messages that could determine the safety of thousands of people. They saw a woman who worked some mysterious government job that paid enough to keep me afloat, but never enough to afford the lifestyle they thought mattered. Rebecca was a partner at the city's most prestigious law firm, her corner office overlooking the harbor, her name on the letterhead that made our parents beam with pride. David had built his medical practice from nothing, saving lives every day in the emergency room, earning the kind of respect that came with white coats and life-or-death decisions. Then there was Michael, the youngest, who had turned his tech startup into a multi-million-dollar empire before his 30th birthday, his face gracing magazine covers as one of the city's most promising young entrepreneurs. And then there was me, Sarah, the one who disappeared for weeks at a time, who missed Christmas dinners and birthday parties, who could never explain where I had been or why my hands sometimes shook when I thought no one was looking. The funeral director called for everyone to take their seats, and I watched as my siblings formed their protective circle, leaving me to find my own place among the distant relatives and family friends who offered polite nods, but nothing more. I had grown accustomed to this isolation, this sense of being on the outside looking in at the family I had spent my entire adult life protecting in ways they could never imagine. The weight of my concealed service weapon pressed against my ribs, a constant reminder of the world I inhabited that they dismissed as unimportant. During the service, I noticed things that others missed because that was what I had been trained to do. The way the man in the third row kept checking his phone despite the solemn occasion, the woman near the back whose eyes scanned the crowd rather than focusing on the casket, the subtle bulge under the jacket of someone who clearly carried but shouldn't have been armed at a civilian funeral. These observations came as naturally as breathing now, 15 years of training and field work having rewired my brain to see threats and anomalies in every situation. My phone vibrated against my leg, and I felt the familiar spike of adrenaline that came with knowing that someone needed the skills I had spent years perfecting in the shadows. I glanced at the screen and saw a message from Director Harrison, the kind of message that made my pulse quicken even after all these years in the field. But this was my father's funeral, and I had promised myself that today would be about family, about grief, about being Sarah the daughter instead of Agent Mitchell the weapon. The pastor spoke about Dad's legacy, about the children he had raised and the lives he had touched, and I felt the familiar sting of knowing that my own contributions to the world would never be mentioned in polite company. My siblings had achievements that could be framed and hung on walls, awards that could be displayed, successes that could be shared at dinner parties. I had commendations locked in classified files, thank you letters from foreign governments that would never see daylight, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that terrorist attacks had been prevented, human trafficking rings had been dismantled, and national security threats had been neutralized because I had been willing to disappear into identities that weren't my own. After the graveside service, we gathered at the church hall for the reception, and I found myself standing alone by the coffee table while conversations flowed around me like water around a stone. I overheard Rebecca telling someone how proud Dad had been of her latest case, how he had kept newspaper clippings of her victories in his wallet. David shared a story about Dad visiting him at the hospital, beaming with pride as he introduced his son, the doctor, to anyone who would listen. Michael pulled out his phone to show photos of Dad at the company Christmas party, grinning beside the awards display that showcased his youngest son's achievements. No one mentioned that Dad had kept a small American flag on his desk at home, or that he had always asked me if I was staying safe at work, or that he had once quietly told me he was proud of me for serving my country even if he didn't understand exactly what that meant. These moments lived only in my memory now, precious and private and impossible to share without revealing truths that could put lives at risk. My phone buzzed again, more insistently this time, and I stepped toward the church kitchen to take the call away from the crowd. The voice on the other end was tense, professional, urgent in the way that meant someone's life hung in the balance while I stood in a church hall making small talk about casseroles and flower arrangements. I found myself torn between two worlds as I had been for 15 years, between the family who saw me as a failure and the agency that saw me as irreplaceable. When I returned to the reception, I noticed that the conversations had taken on a different tone. My cousins were discussing their children's achievements, their promotions, their vacations to Europe, and their new houses in the suburbs. My siblings joined in easily, contributing stories of success and stability and normal lives that made sense to everyone in the room. I listened to Rebecca describe her latest victory in court, to David share news of his promotion to department head, to Michael announce his engagement to a woman whose family owned half the city's real estate. And then the conversation turned to me, as it inevitably did, with that mixture of pity and curiosity that I had learned to endure. Aunt Marie asked about my job with the tone people used when they were trying to be polite about someone's obvious failure to launch. My cousin Jennifer wondered if I was still doing that government work, the way you might ask about someone's unfortunate medical condition. Uncle Bob suggested that maybe it was time I considered a career change, something more stable, something that would allow me to settle down and start a family like a normal person. Rebecca jumped in with what she probably thought was helpful, explaining to the gathered relatives that I worked for some kind of federal agency, but that it wasn't anything important, not like being a lawyer or a doctor or running a real business. She said it with the kind of dismissive wave that suggested my 15 years of service could be reduced to filing paperwork in some forgotten government office. David nodded along, adding that maybe the stress of my job was why I seemed so distant all the time, why I could never commit to family plans or maintain relationships like other people. I felt the familiar weight of secrets pressing down on my chest, the burden of being unable to defend myself without compromising operations that had taken years to develop. They had no idea that my last boyfriend had been a cover identity, that our relationship had been carefully constructed to provide access to an arms dealer who was planning to sell weapons to domestic terrorists. They couldn't know that I had missed Michael's graduation because I was embedded with a human trafficking organization, gathering evidence that would eventually save dozens of children from lives of unimaginable horror. My phone buzzed again, and this time the message made my blood run cold. 3. Words from Director Harrison that meant everything had changed, that the careful balance I maintained between my two lives was about to shatter completely. The message read simply, "Package compromised. Immediate." I looked up to find my family staring at me with that familiar mixture of irritation and disappointment, waiting for me to explain why I couldn't even get through our father's funeral without being distracted by work. Rebecca crossed her arms and shook her head, muttering something about priorities and respect that cut deeper than she knew. David suggested that maybe I should turn off my phone for once, show some consideration for the family that was trying to mourn together. The irony was overwhelming, standing there in a church hall surrounded by people who thought I was the family failure while my phone carried messages that could affect national security. They saw a woman who couldn't hold down a normal job, who couldn't maintain relationships, who disappeared for weeks without explanation and came back looking tired and worn. They had no idea that I had spent the last 3 months living as Maria Santos, a money launderer for a cartel that was planning to finance a series of attacks on American soil. My sister Rebecca approached me with that expression I knew so well, the one that said she was about to deliver another lecture about responsibility and growing up and learning to be part of the family. She had been giving me variations of this speech since I was 25 and first disappeared for a classified training program that I couldn't explain. Over the years, these conversations had become more pointed, more painful, as my siblings built lives that made sense while I remained frozen in a narrative of failure that I couldn't correct without destroying everything I had worked to protect. The phone buzzed again, and I saw 3 missed calls from numbers that meant the situation was escalating beyond anything I could ignore. Rebecca noticed my distraction and her voice rose slightly, attracting the attention of nearby relatives who turned to watch what was clearly going to be another family confrontation. She demanded to know what could possibly be so important that I couldn't focus on Dad's funeral. What kind of job required someone to be on call during their own father's burial? I felt the familiar tension building in my chest, the weight of years of misunderstanding and judgment pressing down like a physical force. My family saw my dedication to my work as selfishness, my inability to share details about my life as secretiveness, my frequent absences as a lack of commitment to them. They interpreted my careful emotional distance as coldness, my hypervigilance as paranoia, my physical fitness as vanity rather than necessity. The truth was that every skill I had developed, every habit I had formed, every choice I had made for the past 15 years had been in service of protecting people exactly like them. The suburban families who slept safely in their beds, the children who played in parks without fear, the business owners who built their dreams without worrying about extremist attacks or foreign interference. My life had become a careful construction designed to keep the darkness away from the lake. To ensure that people like my siblings could continue to believe that their biggest problems were courtroom defeats and difficult patience and market fluctuations. But standing there in that church hall, watching Rebecca's face flush with frustration and embarrassment, I realized that the cost of that protection had been higher than I had ever calculated. I had saved countless strangers while losing my own family, preserved national security while sacrificing personal connections, maintained my cover so perfectly that even the people who shared my DNA saw me as a disappointment rather than a guardian. My phone rang this time instead of buzzing, and the ringtone was the one reserved for Director Harrison himself. The conversations around us died down as people noticed the distinct sound, and I felt every eye in the room turn toward me as I faced a choice that would change everything. I could ignore the call, try to salvage this moment with my family, pretend that their opinion of me mattered more than whatever crisis was developing in the world beyond this church hall. Or I could answer, knowing that doing so would probably shatter whatever fragile connection I still had with the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. Rebecca stepped closer, her voice dropping to a hiss that somehow carried more venom than shouting would have. She told me that this was exactly what she was talking about, that I couldn't even show basic respect at our father's funeral, that maybe it was time I figured out what really mattered in life. David joined her, suggesting that whatever government paperwork I was avoiding could wait a few hours while we honored the man who had raised us all. The phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. Director Harrison didn't make social calls, and he didn't repeat himself unless lives were at stake. I felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with knowing I was needed, that somewhere in the world, a situation was developing that required my specific skills and experience. But I also felt the crushing weight of family disappointment, the knowledge that answering this call would probably be the final straw that severed whatever connection I still had with the people in this room. Michael joined his siblings, forming the united front I had seen so many times before, the 3 successful children standing together against the family failure who couldn't even prioritize properly. They blocked my path toward the exit, demanding explanations I couldn't give, answers that would compromise operations and endanger lives. The room seemed to shrink around us as other relatives began to notice the confrontation, their whispered conversations creating a buzz of judgment and speculation that made my skin crawl. The phone fell silent, then buzzed with a text message that made my heart stop. 2 words from Director Harrison that meant everything I had worked for was about to be exposed, that the careful walls between my 2 lies were about to come crashing down. The message was simple and devastating. They're coming. I stared at those 2 words on my phone screen while my family waited for an explanation I couldn't give. They're coming. Director Harrison never used dramatic language unless the situation was beyond critical, and I knew that whatever was happening would shatter the careful balance I had maintained for 15 years. My hands remained steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system, a testament to training that had become as natural as breathing. But my mind raced through possibilities and protocols while Rebecca's voice faded into background noise. The memories hit me like a physical force, taking me back to that day in college when everything changed. I had been 22, a criminal justice major with decent grades and no clear direction, when Professor Williams pulled me aside after class and suggested I might be interested in a special government program. He had been watching me, he said, noticing how I observed people, how I could read situations and motivations in ways that seemed almost instinctive. What I thought was just natural curiosity, he recognized as the foundation of skills that could serve my country in ways most people never imagined. The recruitment process had been unlike anything I expected. Instead of interviews in sterile government offices, I found myself in scenarios that tested not just my intelligence, but my ability to become someone else entirely. They put me in situations where I had to lie convincingly to people I cared about, where I had to maintain fictional identities under pressure, where I had to make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. I discovered that I had a gift for disappearing into roles, for becoming so thoroughly someone else that even I sometimes forgot where Sarah ended and the cover identity began. The training had been brutal in ways that movies never captured accurately. It wasn't just about learning to fight or shoot or gather intelligence, though those skills became as natural as walking. It was about psychological conditioning, about learning to compartmentalize emotions and experiences so completely that I could watch terrible things happen and still function normally. They taught me to endure physical pain, emotional manipulation, and psychological pressure that would break most people. More importantly, they taught me to do all of this while maintaining the appearance of being perfectly ordinary. My first assignment had been relatively simple, they told me, though nothing about undercover work ever truly felt simple. I was to infiltrate a college environmental group that the Bureau suspected was being radicalized by outside influences. For 6 months, I became Jessica Chun, an idealistic sophomore who believed passionately in saving the planet through any means necessary. I attended meetings, participated in protests, and slowly worked my way into the inner circle where the real planning happened. What I discovered was that the group was being funded and directed by a foreign intelligence service that was using environmental activism as a cover for recruiting agents who could access sensitive government facilities. The young college students thought they were fighting for a better world, but they were actually being groomed to commit acts of terrorism that would destabilize American infrastructure. My testimony helped dismantle a network that had been operating for years, preventing attacks that could have killed hundreds of people. But the cost of that success was learning to live with the knowledge that I had betrayed people who trusted me, even if that betrayal served a greater good. The friends I had made as Jessica Chun never knew that our entire relationship had been a lie, that the person they confided in and laughed with and trusted with their secrets didn't actually exist. I learned to carry that weight, to compartmentalize the guilt and loneliness that came with being professionally duplicitous. Over the years, the assignments became more complex and dangerous. I spent 8 months as Maria Rodriguez, a bartender in a Miami nightclub that was actually a front for money laundering operations. I lived for a year as Jennifer Walsh, a real estate agent in Las Vegas who specialized in helping wealthy clients purchase properties with questionable funds. I became Anna Petrov, a translator who worked for an import business that was smuggling weapons across 3 state lines. Each identity required me to become someone completely different, to adopt new mannerisms, new accents, new ways of thinking and reacting. I learned to prefer different foods, to change my political opinions, to alter my entire personality to match whatever role the mission required. The psychological training had prepared me for this, but nothing could have prepared me for how thoroughly I would lose track of who Sarah Mitchell actually was beneath all the carefully constructed lies. The hardest part wasn't the physical danger, though there had been plenty of that over the years. I had been shot twice, stabbed once, and beaten more times than I cared to remember. I had scars hidden beneath my clothing that told stories I could never share, evidence of missions that existed only in classified files that would be sealed for decades. The hardest part was watching my family's perception of me change from disappointment to embarrassment to something approaching disgust. They didn't understand why I couldn't hold down a normal job, why I disappeared for months at a time with vague explanations about government work. They didn't know that I had been living in a rat-infested apartment in Detroit, pretending to be addicted to heroin while gathering evidence against a drug cartel that was planning to expand operations into 3 major cities. They couldn't comprehend that my inability to maintain relationships wasn't due to commitment issues, but because emotional attachments could compromise operations and endanger lives. My last serious relationship had ended 3 years ago when I realized that I couldn't even remember which opinions were genuinely mine and which belonged to whatever cover identity I was inhabiting at the time. I had been living as Catherine Moore for so long, working as a paralegal to gain access to a law firm that was laundering money for international arms dealers, that I found myself agreeing with political positions that Sarah Mitchell had never held. The line between my real self and my professional personas had blurred beyond recognition. The phone in my hand buzzed again, pulling me back to the present moment where my family stood blocking my path and demanding answers I couldn't provide. This time it was a message with coordinates and a single word that made my blood freeze. Now, Director Harrison wasn't just telling me that they were coming. He was telling me that whatever situation was developing required my immediate presence, that lives were at stake, while I stood in a church hall defending myself against accusations of being inconsiderate. Rebecca's voice cut through my thoughts, sharper now with frustration and embarrassment as she realized that other relatives were watching our confrontation. She demanded to know what kind of job required someone to be constantly available. What kind of work was so important that it couldn't wait for a few hours of family mourning? Her questions carried the implication that whatever I was doing couldn't possibly be as vital as the real careers her siblings had built. If only she knew that 6 months ago, I had spent 3 weeks living in a storage facility, surviving on energy bars and bottled water while monitoring a terrorist cell that was planning to poison the water supply of a major American city. The intelligence I gathered had prevented an attack that could have killed thousands of people, but the victory existed only in classified reports that would never see daylight. My family would never know that their dismissive little sister had saved lives on a scale that most people couldn't comprehend. The irony was suffocating. My siblings had built careers that were publicly celebrated, achievements that could be shared and applauded and displayed with pride. Rebecca's legal victories made headlines. David's medical expertise saved lives in ways that grateful patients could acknowledge, and Michael's business success was visible in every quarterly report and industry award. My contributions to society were measured in disasters that never happened, in attacks that were prevented, in lives that were saved by operations so secret that their very existence was classified. I thought about the commendation letter I had received last year from the Attorney General, praising my work in dismantling a human trafficking network that had been operating across 5 states. The letter was locked in a safe deposit box along with other recognition I couldn't share, awards for service that had to remain invisible to maintain operational security. My family saw a woman who couldn't commit to anything, who lived paycheck to paycheck in a modest apartment, who had never accomplished anything worth celebrating. They didn't know about the medals I couldn't wear, the citations I couldn't frame, the thank you letters from foreign governments whose citizens I had helped protect. They couldn't see the 16 separate identities I maintained in case of emergency activation, each with its own apartment, bank account, and carefully constructed history. They had no idea that I spoke 5 languages fluently and could pass for a native speaker in 3 of them, skills I had developed not for personal enrichment, but for operational necessity. My phone rang again, and this time I could see from the caller ID that it was Agent Chin, my handler for the current operation. The fact that he was calling during what he knew was my father's funeral meant that whatever was happening had escalated beyond the normal protocols. I felt the familiar tension building in my shoulders, the hyper-awareness that came with knowing that my 2 worlds were about to collide in ways that could endanger everyone I cared about. David stepped closer, his voice carrying the authority he had developed as a doctor, the tone he used with patients who weren't following medical advice. He suggested that maybe it was time I grew up and learned to prioritize the people who actually mattered, the family that had always been there for me even when I couldn't be bothered to be there for them. The accusation stung because it contained just enough truth to be devastating, even though the full truth would have revealed the sacrifice behind my absence. I wanted to tell him about the time I had missed his promotion celebration because I was testifying before a secret grand jury about a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of state government. I wanted to explain that I had skipped Rebecca's wedding anniversary party because I was extracting an asset from a situation so dangerous that radio silence was the only thing keeping us both alive. I wanted Michael to understand that I hadn't attended his company's IPO celebration because I was maintaining deep cover in an organization that would have killed me if they discovered my real identity. But those explanations would have required revealing operational details that could compromise ongoing investigations and put other agents at risk. The nature of my work demanded that I bear the weight of misunderstanding, that I accept my family's disappointment as the price of keeping them safe from the darkness I dealt with professionally. They lived in a world where the biggest threats were malpractice suits and difficult clients and market fluctuations, and I had spent 15 years ensuring they could continue to inhabit that relatively innocent space. The phone stopped ringing and immediately started again. Agent Chin was persistent, which meant that whatever situation was developing couldn't wait for family reconciliation or personal considerations. I could feel the familiar pull of duty, the knowledge that somewhere people were depending on skills and experience that I had spent years developing in service of something larger than my own comfort or family harmony. Rebecca grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my skin as she demanded my full attention. She told me that this was exactly the kind of selfish behavior that had driven Dad to despair in his final years, that he had worried constantly about what would become of me when I couldn't even maintain steady employment or normal relationships. Her words hit like physical blows because I knew that Dad had indeed worried about me, though not for the reasons she imagined. The truth was that Dad had been the only family member who seemed to understand that there was more to my story than what appeared on the surface. He never pressed for details about my work, but he had always asked if I was staying safe, if I was being careful, if I was taking care of myself in ways that suggested he suspected the reality was more complex than anyone realized. His final conversation with me had been a quiet request that I find a way to be happy, to build a life that included more than just work, even if he couldn't understand what that work entailed. My phone buzzed with a text message that made my heart skip a beat. For words from Director Harrison that changed everything. Package is your family. The operation I had been tracking, the threat that had been developing, the reason they were coming. It all centered on the people standing in front of me, demanding explanations I couldn't provide. My professional life and my personal life were about to collide in ways that 15 years of careful compartmentalization couldn't prevent. I looked up at my siblings with new eyes, seeing them not just as the family members who had dismissed and misunderstood me, but as potential targets in a game they didn't even know they were playing. The weight of protecting them while maintaining my cover became exponentially more complex, and I realized that everything I had worked to keep separate was about to become devastatingly intertwined. The sound of vehicles pulling into the church parking lot cut through the tension in the room, and I felt every muscle in my body tense with recognition. Those weren't civilian cars, and the people getting out of them weren't here for the funeral reception. Through the windows, I could see the distinctive black SUVs that meant federal agents, the kind of official presence that transformed ordinary situations into something far more serious. My family. Why I noticed my sudden change in demeanor, the way I had unconsciously shifted into a more alert posture, the way my eyes tracked toward the exits and assessed potential threats. Rebecca demanded to know what was wrong, why I looked like I was about to run, what kind of trouble I had brought to our father's funeral. Her voice carried a note of panic now, as if some part of her recognized that the situation had moved beyond mere family dysfunction into something genuinely dangerous. The church hall fell silent as everyone noticed the official vehicles, and I knew that my carefully maintained double life was about to end in the most public way possible. 15 years of secrets were about to be revealed, and there was nothing I could do to prevent it. Director Harrison was walking through the doors, flanked by agents I recognized, and my family was about to learn exactly who Sarah Mitchell really was. Director Harrison walked through the church hall doors with the kind of commanding presence that made every conversation stop and every head turn. He was a man in his 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing, wearing a perfectly tailored suit that spoke of authority without ostentation. Behind him came 4 agents I recognized from various operations, their professional demeanor and subtle alertness marking them as federal law enforcement even to civilians who had never encountered such people before. The room fell into absolute silence as Director Harrison scanned the crowd, his gaze settling on me with the kind of recognition that spoke of years of professional relationship. My family stood frozen beside me, their earlier indignation replaced by confusion and growing alarm as they realized that these weren't random funeral crashers, but official representatives of some kind. Rebecca's grip on my arm tightened unconsciously, and I could feel her beginning to understand that whatever was happening involved me in ways she couldn't comprehend. Director Harrison approached our small group with measured steps, and I felt 15 years of careful compartmentalization beginning to crumble. He nodded to me with the respect reserved for valued colleagues, a gesture that my family couldn't miss despite their confusion. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to briefing senators and cabinet members, someone whose words shaped national policy and directed operations that affected global security. "Agent Mitchell," he said, and those 2 words detonated like a bomb in the quiet church hall. "I'm sorry to interrupt your father's service, but we have a situation that requires your immediate expertise. The Kozlov operation has been compromised, and 3 of our assets are in immediate danger. You're the only agent who has successfully penetrated their organization deeply enough to extract them safely." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched my family's faces transform as the implications of Director Harrison's words settled over them like a slow-motion avalanche. Rebecca's mouth opened slightly, her legal training helping her process the significance of what she had just heard even as her personal understanding of reality shifted completely. David's medical background made him recognize authority when he encountered it, and his expression showed the dawning realization that everything he thought he knew about his sister was wrong. Michael stepped forward, his business instincts making him the first to find his voice. He looked between Director Harrison and me, his mind clearly working to reconcile the sister he had dismissed with the federal agent standing before him. "Agent Mitchell," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah is FBI?" Director Harrison turned his attention to my family with the kind of patient professionalism he used when briefing civilians who had become involved in federal matters. Agent Mitchell is one of our most valuable deep cover operatives, he explained, his tone carrying both respect and slight impatience at having to reveal classified information in a public setting. For the past 15 years, she has infiltrated organizations that pose serious threats to national security. Her work has prevented terrorist attacks, dismantled international criminal networks, and saved countless American lives. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, reshaping everything my family thought they understood about me and about themselves. I watched Rebecca's face as she processed the implications, her sharp legal mind working through years of misunderstood conversations and missed family events. She was beginning to realize that my vague explanations about government work hadn't been evasions born of professional inadequacy, but necessary deceptions required by national security. Aunt Marie sank into a nearby chair, her hand pressed to her chest as she stared at me with wide eyes. The woman who had pitted my inability to find a proper career was learning that I had been serving my country in ways that most people could never imagine. Uncle Bob, who had suggested I needed a more stable job, looked like he was trying to reconcile the family disappointment with the federal agent who commanded the respect of the FBI director. David found his voice next, his medical training helping him maintain composure even as his worldview shifted dramatically. "The times you disappeared," he said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in his expression. "The injuries you explained away as training accidents. The phone calls you always had to take privately. You weren't struggling to keep a job, you were working undercover." I nodded, feeling exposed in ways that 15 years of dangerous operations had never made me feel. Standing in that church hall with my cover blown and my family staring at me with mixtures of shock and growing comprehension was more terrifying than facing armed criminals or infiltrating terrorist cells. These were the people whose opinion of me mattered most, and I was watching them realize that everything they had believed about me was wrong. Director Harrison's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it with the kind of urgency that meant the situation was deteriorating rapidly. "Agent Mitchell, we need to move now. The Kozlov organization has discovered our surveillance, and they're moving to eliminate our assets. You're the only one who knows the extraction protocols and has the necessary trust within their structure to get our people out alive." The weight of the moment settled over me like a familiar burden. 3 agents were in danger because of an operation I had helped develop, and their lives depended on my ability to maintain the cover identity I had spent months constructing. But this time, my family would know exactly where I was going and why, would understand that their sister's mysterious disappearances were actually missions that put me in mortal danger for the safety of others. Rebecca stepped forward, her voice shaky but determined. "How dangerous is this?" she asked Director Harrison, and I could hear the fear she was trying to suppress. For the first time in years, my sister was worried about me not because she thought I was making poor life choices, but because she understood that I was about to walk into a situation that could get me killed. Director Harrison's expression softened slightly as he looked at my family, recognizing their need for honesty after years of necessary deception. "Agent Mitchell specializes in high-risk infiltration operations," he said carefully. "She volunteers for assignments that other agents consider too dangerous because she has skills and experience that make success possible where others would fail. This particular operation involves a Russian organized crime syndicate that doesn't hesitate to kill anyone they perceive as a threat." The color drained from Michael's face as he processed this information. His sister, the family failure who couldn't maintain steady employment, was actually an elite federal agent who regularly risked her life in ways that most people only saw in movies. The irony wasn't lost on any of us that WHI. Though he had been building a business empire, I had been preventing the kind of catastrophic attacks that could have destroyed the economy he operated within. David's medical background helped him understand the physical toll of the work Director Harrison was describing, and I could see him reassessing every time I had appeared at family functions looking tired or stressed or slightly injured. Those hadn't been signs of personal problems, but evidence of professional sacrifice, of a life spent in service to something larger than personal comfort or family harmony. Director Harrison's patience was clearly wearing thin as his phone continued to buzz with updates from the field. "Agent Mitchell, we have a helicopter standing by, and every minute we delay increases the risk to our assets. I need your decision now." I looked at my family, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in 15 years. They weren't the judgmental relatives who had dismissed my contributions to the world. They were civilians who had been protected by my work without ever knowing it. Their ability to yield normal lives, to worry about normal problems, to sleep safely in their beds was possible partly because people like me were willing to live in the shadows and face the threats they never had to acknowledge. "I have to go," I said simply, and the words carried weight they had never held before. This wasn't the selfish departure of someone who couldn't prioritize family, but the professional duty of someone whose skills were desperately needed to save lives. My family understood the difference, and for the first time in years, I saw respect in their eyes instead of disappointment. Rebecca stepped forward and hugged me, something she hadn't done since I was in college. "Come back safe," she whispered, and I heard tears in her voice as she finally understood what goodbye meant in my world. David followed, gripping my shoulders with the steady hands of a surgeon who understood life and death decisions. Even Michael, who had always seemed the most distant, reached out to touch my arm in a gesture of connection and support. As I walked toward the door with Director Harrison and his team, I heard Aunt Marie explaining to confused relatives that Sarah worked for the FBI, her voice filled with pride instead of the pity I had grown accustomed to hearing. Uncle Bob was telling someone that his niece was a hero, using a word he had never applied to me before this moment. The transition from the church hall to the federal vehicles felt like stepping between two different worlds, but for the first time in 15 years, those worlds had acknowledged each other. My family finally knew who I really was, and I had seen their love and pride replace the misunderstanding and judgment that had defined our relationship for so long. Director Harrison briefed me as we drove toward the helicopter landing zone, filling me in on the details of how the Kozlov operation had been compromised and what would be required to extract our assets safely. The familiar rush of adrenaline and professional focus helped center me, but I carried something new into this mission, the knowledge that my family would be waiting for me to return, that they understood the stakes and the sacrifice involved in the work I did. 3 hours later, I was Maria Santos again, walking into a warehouse in Baltimore where 3 federal agents were being held by a criminal organization that would kill them without hesitation if they discovered the truth. The extraction required every skill I had developed over 15 years, every lesson learned from previous operations, every ounce of courage I could summon to maintain my cover while orchestrating their escape. The mission was successful, as most of my missions were, but this time I returned to a family that knew where I had been and what I had risked. When I called Rebecca from the debriefing room 6 hours later, she answered on the first ring with a voice that carried relief and newfound respect. She didn't ask about the details, understanding now that some aspects of my work would always have to remain classified, but she told me she was proud of me in a way that made 15 years of secrecy feel worthwhile. David visited me at my apartment the next day, bringing medical supplies he thought I might need and staying long enough to share stories about Dad that I had missed while maintaining operational security. We talked about the burden of serving others in ways that required personal sacrifice, and for the first time, I felt understood by a family member who recognized the parallels between his medical calling and my federal service. Michael surprised me most of all by offering to help me establish a more comfortable life between operations, understanding now that my modest lifestyle was a choice made for operational security rather than evidence of professional failure. He began including me in family planning not as an obligation but as someone whose dangerous work made every moment together precious and meaningful. The funeral I had dreaded became the catalyst for rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by necessary secrecy. My family learned to see my absences as evidence of service rather than neglect, my emotional distance as professional requirement rather than personal coldness. They began to understand that the sacrifices I made weren't just personal, but were gifts I gave to preserve the safety and freedom they enjoyed as American citizens. 6 months later, at Rebecca's birthday party, she introduced me to her colleagues not as her troubled sister, but as her sister who worked for the FBI. The pride in her voice was unmistakable, and I realized that being known and valued by my family was worth 15 years of misunderstanding. Dad would have been proud to see us together, finally understanding each other across the divide that duty had created, but love had ultimately bridged. The scars I carried, visible and invisible, became symbols of service rather than evidence of a life gone wrong. My family's respect for my work gave new meaning to the sacrifices I had made, and their support made future operations feel less like exile and more like temporary absences from people who understood the importance of what I was doing. I continued working undercover, infiltrating organizations that threatened American security, but I no longer carried the additional burden of family disappointment. When Director Harrison assigned me to new operations, I went knowing that my family understood the stakes and supported my choice to serve in the shadows. Their love became a source of strength rather than a source of guilt, a reminder of what I was protecting rather than what I was sacrificing. The church hall where everything changed became a symbol of transformation, the place where 15 years of necessary deception finally gave way to honest recognition. My family learned that heroism doesn't always wear uniforms or receive public acknowledgement, that some of the most important work happens in secret and is measured not by applause, but by disasters prevented and lives saved. In the end, being known and valued by the people who mattered most made every dangerous assignment worthwhile. My family's pride in my service validated choices that had sometimes felt impossibly lonely, and their support reminded me that even secret agents deserve to be loved and understood by the people they protect. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't the successful completion of a dangerous mission, but the moment when the people you love finally understand why those missions matter. That day at Dad's funeral, I stopped being the family disappointment and became their hero, not because anything about my work had changed, but because they finally knew what I had been doing all along.